So you'll notice that depending on the object that you have selected, you're going to have more or less information available in the inspector panel. The inspector panel is broken down into components, and the components are divided by these horizontal rules. And if you look at each one of these components have a title to it. So every object inside the game view or in the object manager, whether we can see it or not, has a transform component. And the transform component references the position, the rotation, or the scale of the object. I can reposition this object, as I demonstrated in the previous video, once it's selected, by clicking and dragging on one of the axes. And when I do that, you can see that in this case, when I click and drag on the Z axis of my cube object, you can see that I'm influencing the Z value of the transform position Z. If I influence the Y value, you can see that that value is changing, and of course, I can manipulate this content based on the scene interface. I can also key in variables here in this field. So if I wanted to move this object up its Y-axis, I could type in a value, and I can see that content move as I type in those values. In addition, if I want to interface with that content, I can roll my mouse cursor over one of the values here. In this case, the transform position Y. If I roll my mouse right over the Y, you can see my cursor changes to give me a left-right arrow. And if I click and drag, I can also influence that content by clicking and dragging on the component itself. Same thing with rotation. I can rotate these objects. I can scale these objects based on this inspector view. Just beneath the transform component, we have the mesh component. And the mesh component just describes the basic 3D mesh of this object. This object is a 3D object, and therefore it comes with this cube mesh filter. There's not a whole lot that we can do. Just underneath that, we have this box collider. Now, the collider has to do with the physics of this and collision detection of this object. We'll take a closer look at colliders once we start creating some interactivity inside Unity. Just beneath that, we have the mesh renderer, and the mesh renderer will do things like show and hide certain capabilities, like whether an object can cast shadow or receive shadows, or whether we can see it in the first place. And some of these objects, like the material object, has a drop-down menu associated with it. So if I drop down this menu, you can see that there's some additional information hiding in here. So just familiarize yourself with what is being presented to you in the inspector editor, and at this point just experiment with some of these values to see what kind of control you can get over basic objects. In addition to these components, some of these components actually have little check boxes next to them. In the case of the mesh renderer, currently my mesh renderer is turned on. If I check that, my cube is now invisible, it's not being rendered, and it's temporarily turned off. And we can control things, pretty much any kind of component that we have inside the inspector editor can be controlled through interactivity and through scripting. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's really through these different components that we can start to influence and make things interactive inside Unity. So experiment with creating a cube, explore the capabilities of the inspector editor, and start to take a look at some of the information that's being presented to you through that inspector editor. And we'll catch up in the next presentation and start to talk a little bit about cameras and creating some more intentional content.